Well, hello there. Who are you?
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Killing must feel good to God, too. He does it all the time. And are we not created in his image?
We all go a little mad sometimes.
After all, murder is, or should be, an art.
I could kill you now pretty easily. Do some interesting things before anyone showed up.
What are these films you can't wait to look at?
Welcome to the Final Girls podcast and the 6th episode of our series dedicated to on-screen serial killers of horror film history. I'm Anna Pokutska, your podcast host who prefers to be rude but alive. In this episode, I'm joined by writer and actor and friend of the pod, Isaura Barbé-Brown, to decode two genuinely harrowing films, both of them first-time viewings for me. First up, we talk about 10 Rillington Place, a grimy masterpiece based on the crimes of a very real and very British murderer, John Christie, who killed 8 women in the 40s and early 50s. The other is Dutch horror film Spoorloos, also known as The Vanishing, which is entirely fictional and was described by Stanley Kubrick as the most terrifying film he'd ever seen. Spoorloos depicts the kidnapping of a young woman from several perspectives, including that of her kidnapper and her desperate boyfriend. Both are unusual horror films. They infect more than they terrify. They're full of soft-spoken violence, showing crimes happening in broad daylight and featuring killers that are pathetic, mundane, and utterly convinced of their own specialness. Listener discretion is advised for this episode, both for spoilers as per usual, but also for the content of the films. And if nothing else, go watch The Vanishing, truly one of the most ingenious horror films I've ever seen. You can see what other films I'm going to be discussing during this series over on our Letterboxd page, which I'll link in the show notes and which I'm updating constantly. And if you enjoy this episode, although enjoy might be the wrong word here, please do head over to Apple Podcasts and give us a review or a rating. Really helps listeners discover the show. And with all of that said, here's our take on 10 Rillington Place and The Vanishing. Amazing. So thank you so much for your time this morning to talk about these truly, genuinely depraved movies.
Genuinely depraved. I'm ready for it. I'm like in my pajamas, got tea, fully ready.
So before we kick into our conversation about 10 Rillington Place and The Vanishing, I wanted to ask a couple of more general questions that I'm asking everyone this series. So what do you think when you think of serial killers in movies?
Like, what kind of movies do I think about?
Whichever way you want to interpret that.
Ooh. I think about it in terms, I think there's a morbid fascination with serial killers, right? Because I think there's lots of types of murder we understand. Like, we understand crimes of passion a bit more. We understand murdering because, like, you're doing a crime, you get caught or something. There's, like, types of murder that we're like, yes, I understand how that happened. And serial killers, like, on a different level. And I think there's kind of a mysticism about them. Almost like, they kind of make them almost like there's a thing to make them like super villains, to make them smarter than everyone, because it's so intriguing, I think, as a person, because most of us, I hope, are so far away from ever committing serial murders, that it's like a fascinating subject. So I think there are so many films and like TV shows and things about them, because we are morbidly fascinated with the kind of people that would do this, and there's kind of a mysticism that's like maybe fun or interesting to write about make films about. So I watch a lot, like I like serial killer films because I'm also I'm always like, yeah, what is, and like I'm always like, I want to know what's the thinking behind why would you wake up one day and just be a serial murderer? So weird. But like so,
yeah, it's like understanding the logic of the illogical.
Yeah. And so that's what I tend to think about when I think about movies about them. I think it's the working out of that mysticism and of that like unknowable thing, or in trying to make sense of a thing that doesn't make sense.
And as we move into 10 Rillington Place, which is a film very much rooted in reality and based on a real life serial killer, one of the things that kind of keeps coming up in the series, because some of the films are completely fictional, like The Vanishing, which we'll talk about later, but a lot of them are obviously either inspired by or directly adapting real life murders. So what do you think about this intersection between true crime and horror?
I think it's the extension of that, especially when something's been real that's happened. It's trying to make sense again and like place this person who did these things in a space, in a time, even though we'll never know the exact details, right, of what they thought about themselves, or how they decided, or do you know what I mean, like how the actual like minute by minute things happened. I think it's basically this, there's something almost comforting about going, this is how it happened. This is the kind of person they were. This is how this happens. This is the thing we're scared of. Here's what it looks like. And I think that's a lot of like the true crime, like horror. Like I think it's a obsession with something that we're scared of happening in real life, and it's just like, especially when we know it's happened, that we know these monsters, like in air quotes, are out there. And this kind of makes it safe. It makes it knowable. It's like, yes, if I can get enough information about how this happens and the kind of people that do this, then I'll somehow be safer from it. Or like know more about it, or be able to spot it. And it's like, probably not. But it's a nice thought that maybe, like, do you know what I mean? It's interesting because obviously, like, a lot of the time it's random. It feels quite random. Like there's no way you predict. Do you mean? And we're watching it after the fact, going, how would you not know that this person? It's like, yeah, but why would you think that? You would never think that.
Yeah.
So I think it is a kind of a comfort.
There's also, I think, like especially with the more American movies, there is not that it's glamorized, but it's definitely more polished than reality. And this is kind of what really struck me about 10 Rillington Place, a film that I had not seen before wanting to cover it in this, and that is disturbing in a way that no American serial killer movie has been disturbing, in the sense that it completely disregards the Hollywood polish, even though it's directed by a Hollywood film director. One of his previous true crime inspired films, The Boston Strangler, will also be covered in the series. But let's get into 10 Rillington Place then, and kind of navigate it gently, because it is a real life case, and I think that needs a little bit more of a careful treading around it, because there were real life people who were killed, including an innocent man who was hanged for a murder that he didn't commit. So tell me about your experience watching this film, and how much did you know about John Christie before watching 10 Rillington Place?
So it was kind of, it's like that London like folklore, where the same with like Dennis Nielsen.
Yeah,
there's kind of, some of the, especially when you're a kid, like the gorier details,
yeah,
but not really any of the full story. Like, so the Dennis Nielsen, for example, like people knew about, they found like flesh in the sewers, basically. Like that was the biggest point that anyone remembered. And with this, it was the bodies in the kitchen, like behind the it was that part that like I didn't know anything about the specifics of who he murdered. I think it wasn't even, I didn't know it was even women entirely, like who he like specifically murdered. I didn't know it was his wife. I just knew it was in Notting Hill, and I knew that there were bodies found in the kitchen. And I think one of my friends when I was at like school lived near where it was. So that was also like, yeah, which is also like because it's like, you know, I mean, before it got knocked down, the actual house, now the other houses built like around, I think, and partly on the grounds. But before it was knocked down, it was like a tourist destination in the same way people do now, where they go to true crime places. Like people would go take pictures outside it. It was like this massive, notorious thing. So it just kind of gets filtered through. Do you know what I mean? And like my childminder was like, you know, an elderly East London lady who like lived in London her whole life, and so she would tell me stuff. Like, oh yes, that man who killed. Oh yeah, terrible. That kind of way, terrible. That man who killed all those people. Yes, terrible. So like,
so did you have that in mind when you came to the film for the first time?
When I saw the film for the first time, it took me a long time to even connect the dots in the same way it did me and Dennis Still. So I was like, oh, that's that part of that story I know. Because part of your brain, when you hear it as a kid, part of my brain, I think, had kind of assumed that it wasn't even true.
Yeah. Like
it was just one of those things that you hear about.
Yeah.
And then when it was that point of being like, oh, that's real, that I know that part of the story. Like, so I think I was watching the film, I must have been like a teenager. And it was like, what I think probably like not quite close to the end or something, that I was like, oh, I know parts of this. That's a true thing. Like I've heard this. So it was like and I don't think when I watched it the first time, it must have been just on TV, I don't think I connected that it was even a true story. Like it just took a while for my brain to connect the dots. And I think that's happened with quite a lot of those things where it's just like, oh, that's real. The Mole Man of Hackney's the one, that guy who dug loads of tunnels under his house, and like you just hear the term the Mole Man of Hackney, and I don't know, I just assumed that wasn't a real thing, and then you're like, oh no, that's real. Oh, we did that. And so like it's just something when you're like, you have it confirmed, and you're like, oh, so yeah, it was surreal, because then you realize how like you said, like depraved it is. I think we do a funny thing as well with stuff like that with folklore. Where we kind of make it like it's like this like sensational, like titillating story, right? Like, and then realizing like, oh no, this is really dark, rather than just being like, oh, that guy, isn't it like crazy that a serial killer lived there? Either being like this like kind of fun tidbit London folklore, it suddenly becomes like, oh, like that's horrifying. That's genuinely horrifying. And that's like the same way they teach you about Henry VIII, where they're just like, oh, they had like a cute rhyme. You're like, when you get older, you're like, oh, he just tried to murder all his wives. Like he was just an absolute menace. Like, so yeah, I think it was that kind of shift in like thinking when it becomes very real, and you're just like, oh, that's horrible, kind of thing.
So the thing that struck me about this film, and I had heard about it, I knew was this very well-regarded sort of true crime, a fictional adaptation of a true crime case. I knew Richard Fleischer, the director, and I knew the people that were in the film, notably John Hurd and Richard Attenborough. I had not seen it in advance, and when I tell you that I felt like I needed to shower immediately after this film, part of it has to do with the intense realism of the film, the intense like visual and, you know, production design. We'll talk about this, but it's not that much production design as it is real life locations.
Yeah.
As well as the overall kind of griminess of it, because it's set in post-war Britain, which was not a fun place to be in. No. Not a polished or a very clean place. And kind of felt the same way that I felt after watching Frenzy for the first time, the Hitchcock film from 72, where there is no longer that distance between me and London because I've been here for 10 years, that now I'm like, oh no, I recognize this way of speaking, these locations, the pub, these like mannerisms of people, and that closeness, which I cannot, it's only a fraction of what you must have experienced, kind of hearing about this stuff your entire life, or kind of that becoming a part of folklore and things that people talk about in general. It is so unbelievably gritty in a sense that is not at all the gritty of the Nolan Batman films. It's gritty in the sense that none of this is pretty, and it's not trying to make murder pretty or interesting or give any grand explanation for the motivations of this man or the way that he performed these acts. It is so straight-faced. I honestly at times felt like I was watching a sort of a faux documentary.
Yeah, they really don't shy away from like the grime of it all, and like even the closeness of like the rooms that are being rented, that felt very real. That felt like, God, this is what it would have been like. You just literally would have been in these tiny spaces, and like in your neighbour's life in a way that would feel now too much. Like imagine your downstairs neighbour like being in your business in that way. Like even there's an amazing scene where John Hurt comes home and Attenborough's there to be like, oh, this person knocked on the door and there's someone here. Like, and it's just like, it'll be so surreal now. You'd be like, okay, thanks. Like,
yeah.
Please don't talk to me. Please get back in your house. And it's like, even him, like, so when he has the argument with his wife, like right after that, and he just comes upstairs, and it's just, even that would be seen as like, people feel weird about calling the police when they do hear like a violent argument now. They feel like they've if they call the police, not even intervene themselves. So it captured like a very specific way of life that doesn't really exist in London in the same way anymore. And I think it did it really successfully, because you immediately got the understanding of how that would have felt, or like just the closeness, the griminess, the frustration of it all. The not having enough money, how you had to live on the money you had. Like this was like the best option, like one of the best options available, right? Like a two rooms and that's it. Like,
how much of this film do you think is sort of gritty kitchen sink drama versus serial killer movie?
That's interesting, because I think a lot of it kind of is kitchen sink drama, right? Because we do see some of the murders.
Well, we start off with a murder.
Starting off with that really sets a tone, so it's not just like relationships and conversations. They're like, this is who he is. Immediately they're like, he's this man. He's not at any point actually like a friendly neighbor, and I think it's really clever to set that in your mind right away. Because if it started with just, if it started with just like Beryl and Timothy moving in upstairs, and then it's like leading up to like, oh, and then we find out like the kind of man he is. It's like, no, this is who he is. Let's start there, and then we'll show you how he had people convinced he wasn't this person.
Yeah.
So I think it starts off more like a serial killer film, and then kind of ends more towards like a like what feels like a BBC drama, like a kitchen sink. Like it kind of veers that way more towards the end, but it felt like a conscious decision rather than. It felt like, he knew he was going to end with the trial and stuff like that, so he started with the darker things, or like that was kind of more the first half of the film. And it's interesting because I guess in our mind, like serial killer movies, there's a lot of like hunting feeling involved usually.
Yes.
And there's not any of that. It's so laid back almost, like he just kind of almost waits for people to come to him.
He is really like a spider, isn't he? He sort of waits for people to turn up into his web, and then he has I was really struck by the smallness of his operation. Like, he has this little locked mini sort of tiny shelf in the kitchen. So there's almost identical tiny shelf which has, like, you know, paracetamol and aspirin and whatever in the kitchen, and he has one that's locked that he only has the key to, that no one else needs apparently, in this teeny tiny kitchen that's like the size of my desk that I'm sitting on right now, and there's a tiny storage space and no one is interested, which is like the most British thing I've ever seen.
I know. And he just always has the keys on him, and it's just like, okay.
And he like unlocks it, and he has this tiny sort of cardboard thing that he uses to drug his victims.
Yeah.
And then this tiny piece of rope that he uses to choke them. And I'm like, this is like this, you know, small living approach to serial killings. Like, you don't need much else, do you? Just this tiny thing, but that is his mechanism. And it's so almost brazenly in your face. Like, this is not even great hiding.
No.
And
like, if the police came, it's like, well, they immediately find this. So, like, what's the plan?
And I wonder kind of as well, you know, about the casting of it. And obviously this film is now over 50 years old. So we have another 50 years of Richard Attenborough, you know, becoming a national treasure or whatnot. But what do you make of this particular casting of him as John Christie? Kind of, how do you... It seems unfathomable to see Richard Attenborough perform a character like this. There's almost something of a Peter Lorre to him, because he's got such a round face and those big eyes. And when he switches into kind of killing mode, it's not just the act on screen that is troubling, it's the public persona of the actor portraying him that messes around with your perception of it. How did that make you feel?
Well, for me, Attenborough there's like two Attenboroughs. There's young Attenborough, and then there's like Grandpa Attenborough.
Okay.
There's like lovable Santa Claus Attenborough, and Jurassic Park founder, misguided Jurassic Park founder Attenborough, and then there's before Attenborough, where he could do anything. Like, I think he's such a good actor because those people don't even connect in my brain. Like, I had to remind myself, like, I'm like, oh, that's the same man, because they feel like entirely separate people to me. And I think he played it so well because he plays him. Again, like, I feel like there's a temptation always with serial killers, even ones we know about, right? Like, even ones that were real. There's a temptation to make them like these incredibly smart, incredibly calculated, who like by one mistake get caught kind of situations. And he plays him so desperate, so pathetic. And I think that was the exact right tone. I was like, I don't think this character could be anything else. And you see it in the first murder, like he's breathing and everything. You know what really shocked? What did shock me is like, because he still does play quite respectable people, like young Attenborough. In the first murder, he like grazes the woman's breast, like as she's like passing out before he like moves to the floor, and that honestly, like, I remember that being like, oh my, like, that really shocked me the first time I saw it, because I just didn't expect it, especially in an older film with this. I don't know, I just wasn't ready, even though I knew what it was about. Like, I knew that people were going to get murdered. I don't know, there was something so shocking about. I'm obviously glad they didn't have like full rape scenes in it, but like almost that, like, his breathing and that bit at the beginning of it's a start of the film, like right at the beginning, it really like shocked me, where I was like, oh, like I said, it's like, this is exactly who this man is. Like, you can hear how he's enjoying this, and it's just, there's something so, and I think you can't really see him, like when he's actually like murdering, like they're just off camera, like just below camera, and it honestly was so disgusting, and you're not seeing anything, it's just his breathing, you can hear just how worked up he is, and I was like, oh, this is foul. And I think I was genuinely, I looked up whether he got nominated for any awards for it, and he didn't, which really surprised me.
Yeah, John Hurt got nominated for a BAFTA, but he didn't.
BAFTA. Yeah, and I think maybe it was a time, maybe like British society was a bit like, oh no, can't give an award to someone playing a murderer. Whereas nowadays, I think that performance would have got him nominated for something, because it is something else, like, because he really portrays this idea of like him not being able to help himself, and I think that's really hard to convey without him saying it. There's like no exposition to it. It's just the way he performs these acts that you can tell that he's just always thinking about the next time he gets to do it.
He really is also playing him as someone who is utterly convinced of his own virtue. Like, he's a liar in every single sense, but he's mostly lying to himself. You know, I don't think he even thinks, or at least the film doesn't seem to imply that he thinks of the things that he does as murders.
Right.
It's just, you know, something he does. My little thing. It's like my little side hobby thing. That's gonna, oh, it's a bit embarrassing. No, it's not. It's full on murder, my guy.
It's full on murder. You have a little kit, dude. And like the fact that his wife, like the part like towards the end when his wife is like doesn't want to sleep in the same room as him, he's like genuinely surprised.
Yeah, he's like, what do you mean?
He's like, why wouldn't you? Like, and at that point, I think he's realised that his wife probably knows where his kiss is, right? He's such a fascinating character, because, like, I think you're right. I think he just really believes, because of his history as, like, a special constable, like, in the war, he believes that he can't really do anything. He couldn't possibly be doing anything wrong.
Well, and also that he could never be seen as doing anything wrong. And I think this is where kind of the real chillingness of the film comes into play. It's how it really makes super evident and not at all subtextual kind of the inequality and the class dynamics that exist between John Christie and Tim Evans, who's the character played by John Hurt, who moves in with his wife and their new baby into the flat. His wife gets murdered by John Christie, and then Tim Evans gets tried, convicted, and executed for a murder that he didn't commit. Christie murdered both his wife and his toddler. And there is this scene immediately after, you know, the wife's body, the wife is dead, and he shows him her body and kind of makes up the story how it was an abortion gone wrong, and that it was sort of her fault in any way because she was taking these abortion pills and kind of messed around, and he would have solved it if only they had asked him in time. But during this entire time, he's also kind of subtly manipulating Tim into being like, well, you can't tell the police because then, you know, I'm going to be in trouble. But then also I was a constable for 5 years. So obviously they're going to believe me. And he starts very gently but firmly twisting around the truth to essentially convince Tim to not go to the police, and also to convince him that actually it wasn't a murder at all, and that he should just let Christie dispose of the body of his wife and just go off somewhere and pretend like he doesn't know what is happening at all. And there's this thing of, who do you think they would believe, me or you?
Yeah.
And like, how do you think the film continues to tap into these dynamics between the quote-unquote respectable Christie and the lower class Tim, not just in their interactions but also in the trial that makes up a big portion of the film?
So I do think at the time the class lines would have been far more defined. So I feel like that's even why Beryl and Tim trust him with a lot of stuff. The fact that they're like looking to get an abortion, they can't afford a second baby. And this man who lives downstairs like, oh, I can do that. And they just go, okay, great. Like, no further questions. Like, and I think it's to do with, I think there was a real sense of like a real defining line between the classes in the way that it's a bit more blurred now. I mean, the fact that, so Timothy couldn't read, he was like illiterate, he couldn't read or write. Even stuff like that, like it was just, when we say that someone didn't have education, it's not like now where it's like they didn't go to uni, or maybe they didn't go to conventional uni, or maybe like, but we wouldn't assume that they hadn't read or couldn't do certain things or whatever. Whereas I think before, like, the people who were kept at a certain class level really were kept there in a way that meant that they couldn't progress past a certain point, in a way that education in a wider sense wasn't available to them. They probably have been working from a very young age. They are limited in the jobs they could get. And I think if you were above them in any way, I think it would have been much easier to convince someone that these things, because they had no way of checking that. They had no one to ask, they had no one looking it up, they had no way of, like, do you mean? So it was, if you could say with enough confidence that this is how this works, this is what's happened, he knew that Tim was in a position that he couldn't confidently question him. He could tell him the police will say this and the police will think this, and of course Tim would believe him, right? This person's educated, this person knows more than me, this person is going to be believed more than I am. And because even stuff like, not being able to read or write, it means that even if Tim's communication is effectively, like, also hindered, right? Even explaining himself, explaining why he did things, is hard for him to articulate exactly how the steps happened, even the fact that he couldn't necessarily say, I was being manipulated, right? Stuff like that wasn't in his vocabulary. It's like John Christie knew all of that. He knew that his best bet was that this person wouldn't even be able to communicate effectively how this happened, the steps this happened in, the things he said to him afterwards, the way he presented her body. It's just... and even his confession, you can see it, because he's trying to confess to something. He's not even entirely clear. He said, I did away with her body. And it's like, it's confusing for him. It's easy trap to fall into, right? He doesn't even really understand what he feels responsible, but he can't explain how or why. And we see it now, right? We see it now anyway, even though the classes are like in some ways less defined. We see it now with like race and gender and whatever, like the types of things that people are able to get away with, the types of defenses they're able to use in terms of like crimes they've committed and stuff like that. But then I feel like there would have been even less of an investigation into, there would have been like, well, obviously this is a person who tells the truth, and this is a person who's more late to life, just based on how much respectability, like, I mean, it's just imagined.
And also the amount of humanity that is allowed in that moment. So the interrogation scene with Tim, there's two, and the second one is particularly grueling because they just let slip that his baby is also has been murdered, that has been found dead, and he didn't know this information. He was just asking about, when he can go pick her up from the place, from Acton, I think, where Christie said that he was going to leave her so he could dispose of Beryl's body. And there is so much, I mean, John Hurt was a wonderful actor, we all know this, but there is just so much going on in the way that everything around him is so cold and so set up to make him fail, to just make him confess and get it over and close this case. And he's just realizing in that moment, processing what has happened, but also that not just his wife is dead, a fact he already knew, but that his daughter is also gone.
Yeah.
And there's absolutely no allowance for him to, feel these things.
And it's just, there's this thing also, I think, that would have been happening at the time, where there would have been almost a blind trust in the authorities to find out the truth. There's that thing of like, well, of course the police and lawyers and stuff will want to know the truth and will believe me when I tell the truth, because why wouldn't they, right? So there's that, and there's a heartbreaking bit when, he's on trial and I think he's in his cell and he says, we need to talk to Christie. That's when you need to get out to see him. Like, he'll clear this up. There's still that belief that somehow it's miscommunication. Yeah. Somehow.
And that someone wouldn't lie.
Got a bit confused. Right. And even the fact, like, obviously we are more entrenched in like crime and true crime and horror films and all that stuff now than we ever have been. But at the time, it would have been unthinkable. It wouldn't make sense, right? it would never be your assumption that, like, this person's murdered my wife, because the idea that a murderer is living downstairs from you would just not even be a thing.
And also, we're much more understanding, or at least much more cognizant of the way that structures work, and that structures are not in service of people, they're in service of themselves.
Right.
That police enforcement, the justice system, whatever it is, any kind of system is more liable to biases maybe than even individuals are, because it is entirely built on maintaining a certain power status quo, and it will do whatever it takes to continue enforcing that. But as you mentioned, there is just this completely innocent, open-hearted belief that this system, the police, the court, are there to find the truth and protect the people who have been harmed, in this case Tim and his family. And they're not. And the real Tim Evans got executed, and I believe if not the last one, it was one of the last capital punishments in the UK, because it was such a gross mishandling of a case that and when Christie was discovered years later, it ended up they pardoned him posthumously and moved his body to a consecrated cemetery, but the harm had been done twice over.
Yeah. And I think it started the process of ending capital punishment in the UK, right? So that was one of the cases cited for the reason to end capital punishment, because I think as well because they were hanging people, right? It's not like in America where death row is just you sitting there for years before that happens. So there's actually, so if he had been in America, for example, on death row, he would have been alive most likely by the time Christie got found out, by the time he confessed, by the time like Christie was on trial and whatever. Whereas when it was happening in England, it was quite quickly that when you were sentenced to death, it happened quite quickly. So it's devastating, because even the fact that this person clearly was struggling to communicate exactly what's happened, clearly wasn't like some amazing liar who was there tricking everyone. It's like, no, he's trying to explain himself and he's finding it difficult. And the fact that no one wanted to investigate that further, the fact they didn't even do like proper searches of Christie's house, it's all this stuff. Like, I feel like because he was, a lot of the time he's victim to women coming to him because of ailments or because of like very specific things. I feel like the trail wouldn't have been that hard to find, but they weren't interested in it because it seemed like an open shut case. And part of Timothy Evans' downfall was obviously like he had violent altercations with his wife. They did have these blazing rows. He was like a heavy drinker. There were all these things that were like kind of trappings of his position in life, which is a lot of domestic relationships in that time, because everything was so hard, and marriage wasn't necessarily because we're so in love and whatever. It was just a thing you did, and the life was hard. I think at the time he says something like he's on like £7 a week, right? Like, which I think the equivalent in today's money works out to be like 200 something pounds a week. So they were really poor, they were really struggling, and everyone had these assumptions, like them fighting and him being violent and him being in the pub all the time and spending their money would have been for people who consider themselves like higher class than Timothy and whatever, like probably a lot of people on the jury. It would have been like, oh, of course, he's this person, this is their life, this is something he would obviously do. Bear in mind that like if that was the case, it probably would have been a crime of passion. It probably would have been discovered immediately, rather than this like calculated hiding of a body. Do you mean it's disregarding all of that? Like, if it was that they had a fight that went too far, then probably that would have happened in a way that certainly their downstairs neighbor would have known immediately, or like, I don't know, but it just fit a narrative so neatly for them. And it just confirmed what they would have thought about this kind of person anyway, that I just think they didn't feel the need to look any further. And it's that juxtaposed with Attenborough playing, I don't know if this actually happened, but when he's going to, so he said to Beryl, Tim's wife, I'll perform the abortion, I'll come up to you tomorrow in the afternoon, blah, blah. And he tells Tim to be out for the day and whatever. And he packs his little bag. And again, you can hear how excited he is. Yeah. He is packing his little bag, and it's like this ritualistic thing for him. He's got rid of his wife for the day. He's got to run a task errand for him. And then the builders come round, and he's what I thought was an amazing touch. I don't know if this is based on anything true, but he makes her a cup of tea, and I was like, this is the most British, weird. He's like, oh, I'll make her a cup of tea, and I'll come up and I'll give her a cup of tea right before I murder and rape her and
Oh, but the cup of tea is also, I think it's got something in it, doesn't it?
Oh, does it? I didn't even see that. But it's just, you can see that he's panicked, right? But for everyone else, there's no reason why he'd be panicked. But you can see he's just because his little plan's been ruined. His little day, horrible day has been ruined.
And the absolute kind of distress and disappointment with which he pours out the cup of tea into the garbage, into the sink. That is the most British thing I've ever seen. Yeah.
You're kind of annoyed that you made tea that's been ruined now. But then also there's an amazing bit where he's downstairs and Beryl leans over the banister and she's like, are you coming? She's quite eager to get this done, which I think is also another discussion. I think it's so fascinating that this is how also he got with these desperate women in these situations.
Yeah. This
could ruin their life, having another baby. It's so serious, right? She's so eager because she's like, we cannot have another child.
Yeah. This is not a romantic notion. It will make us destitute. And he frames it as such a favor, because he's like, well, it is illegal, so I could get into a lot of trouble. So I'm really putting myself on the line here to do you a favor.
Right. And the way he gets himself, because he's like, oh, I know people who could do it, but it costs you money. And she's like, well, I can't. He knows exactly their position, puts him in this really awful situation. But there's a bit where he's downstairs and she leans over the banister and says, are you coming? And then he's like, oh, the builders are in. And obviously she probably assumes his panic is on the fact that he's doing this illegal thing while there's other people in the house. Whereas for him, it's just ruined the stuff he wants to do in complete peace and privacy, right? He just wanted the place to himself so he could do these awful things to Beryl. And now the builders are in and it might ruin it. And the fact that she starts screaming almost does. There's a bit where he says, I don't want to hurt you, when he's killing her.
Yeah.
I don't want to hurt you. Because he doesn't see what he's already doing as hurting her, right? He doesn't see he's already drugging her. He's going to murder her. He's going to do awful things to her body. Doesn't see that as hurting her. He means, I don't want to hit you, which is somehow worse in his head. That's something that her husband would do, which is, he's not a man. He would never do that. Never raise his hand to a lady, but doesn't see what he's doing as
that is uncouth. That's uncouth. It's rude. It's downright rude, but murder isn't.
The way he's doing it, they're practically asleep, right? So gentle.
On this note, and not to be flippant about this film, can we talk about Christie's choice of keeping his victims' bodies in the kitchen behind some wallpaper?
So the only thing I could think of, right, and again, I think this is captured really well, is that London would have been very stinky, especially the little houses where there's one up, one down, where people are living in that closer quarters. That I'm the reason he knew, because people just been oh, that's some bad smell, must be just London, is the only thing I can think of. The fact that he put them in the alcove and then was wallpaper. I'm not gonna use anything more substantial. I'm not gonna get concrete. I'm not gonna get anything that potentially would at least mask the smell or be harder to get into. He was I'm going to paper over it. That'll be fine. And I don't know what, and this is what I liked about this film, because again, they resisted the urge to make him this kind of genius, right? So a genius, when he's murdering Beryl, would have been the builders are in, probably off for today. Probably shouldn't do this today. Should probably leave it. Or even Beryl's friend comes round, right? And he's just holding the door shut. And again, the baby's still there. There's all these things where you're just probably the wrong day, John. But he can't help himself, right? He's just this little depraved animal that can't help himself. And the same with the bodies. There is no thought for the afterwards. There was no real he doesn't have a long-term plan in any way.
Mm-hmm.
He is literally just like, oh, now there's this kind of inconvenient thing.
He's all about the immediate.
Yeah.
He doesn't think about, like, even the killing of Beryl. It's like, you share a house with her husband.
She's your upstairs neighbor. Like, what are you doing? Like, how do you think you're not linked to this? But even the fact that, like, and then it's like he didn't think about the baby even.
Yeah.
Like, the baby was an afterthought where he's like, oh shit, there's a baby. Like,
I guess I have to go kill a baby now.
Yeah, and then even the way he tells you, oh, I can't believe what he did. He's like to his wife, oh yeah, killed the baby. It's like, you are like insane. You've got up in the night, murdered a child, and gone to your wife like, you're not going to believe what I found upstairs. As if that's like the levels of it. It's like he's just dealing with problems as they arise. It's like he does the thing he wants to do, and that's the main, like, event. That's the only thing he's thinking about. And then he's like, oh no, there's a body. Oh no, there's a baby. And he's literally just like, what do I do with that now? And he's like, literally with bodies, he's like, out of sight, out of mind. He's like, if I put it somewhere that I can't immediately see it, then I guess that's dealt with. Because the bodies in the garden were like buried very shallow. The bodies in like the washroom, like that was outside, like the little bathroom thing outside, were just like there wrapped up in stuff. And the bodies in the alcove, it was more a space issue than anything else, right? He's just like, incubator. But he wasn't even really trying to hide them in any way that was effective. He was just kind of like, if I don't see them, then no one else will, and as long as no one ever looks for more than 5 seconds, then I'll probably be fine.
Which I guess is the actual power of this movie. And I was trying to think, is this a horror movie? Is this the most British horror movie ever made? And probably yes. And I think what's really interesting about this film is that it barely shows us the killings, and when it does, it barely shows us the bodies as well, for which I'm grateful. Like, we see sort of a little bit, especially around the discovery of the bodies, and it's kind of horrific in how mundane it is, as you were saying, kind of so shallowly hidden, kind of hidden in these carrier bags almost. And the killing of Beryl is harrowing, but it's also very much framed from his perspective. It's framed on his face, on what he's doing, on his breathing, on the way his eyes look, the way that he kind of gets excited by the situation. And that makes it so obscene to look at. And, we've barely touched on the direction of the film, but I wanted to mention that the production design is so light touch and so effective. This is an American director coming in to Britain to film this real life case that really shook the British population at the time, that still remains in our consciousness. And it's incredibly grimy, obscene, and very leering through the way that he films the place. The fact that he filmed on location. It's not 10 Rillington Place, I think it's 7 Rillington Place, so it's one of the next door houses. The smallness of the rooms, the tininess of all the acts, kind of the gray and brownness of it all is so engulfing that everything feels so sweaty and gross, that actually even Tim and Beryl, who are young and, in a difficult marriage, but very much kind of care about one another, even when they're sort of making kind of ill-informed choices or don't know how to articulate themselves, and I'm thinking a lot about Tim's character here, you can't help but feel for them, because they are just young and doing the best they can within the structures and the culture that they know, and that fail them so terribly. There is something so unrelentingly bleak about every single element of this film, from the production design to the story to the performances to even the performances of the murder, that it doesn't feel like any horror film, or it doesn't feel like most horror films, and because of that, it sticks to your skin in a really unusual way.
Yeah, and to the point where, like, I I know this film isn't in black and white, but I always remember it as being a black and white film.
Oh.
Because of how grim it is.
Oh, interesting.
In my mind, when I play back scenes, they're like in black and white, and I'm like, that's not, I know it's in colour. There's something so like grey about it. And I think the direction is amazing because, like I said, there's moments that are meant to be shocking, right? So I think there's the scene at the beginning where you see him murder someone, and like I said, the breast raise is like quite shocking, I think. There's a murder of Beryl because he hits her, right? And you see that, and that's quite shocking because I think it's the first time that you've seen like, oh, this is violence. This is like, this is what he believes is like the actual violence of the thing. Even him getting up in the night to go kill the baby is quite a shock. It's so cold and slow, and like you're just seeing pretty slippers on, his glasses on. It's like really horrible. And then the finding of the bodies, right? So he was obviously like fairly destitute by the end, like he didn't have anything. The fact that he was like, I'll just leave the bodies there, I guess, and just assume no one would find them, which is baffling. And shout out to Patrick from EastEnders, the actor who finds the bodies, the black guy who finds the bodies. That's quite shocking when he shines a torch in there and you see the first body is like a woman, the back of a woman without her clothes on, just her underwear on, like kind of in like child's pose, like, and that's quite, because that's the most graphic viewing of a body we've seen at this point, right? Like we haven't really, like you said, we don't really see the bodies, and the rest of them are wrapped up. But seeing that, like an almost nude woman, knowing that she's just been shoved in there like that, and that is like a moment again that is like, oh my god. And again, I think everything's so underplayed. Even the reaction of the person who finds it, when he goes out, he just sits on the stairs like, get the police. And I was like, I love how underplayed this is. I don't really know what I'm looking at. I know it's bad. I'm not gonna investigate any further. I'm just gonna get the police here because what on earth? And the fact that when they walk in, like, it smells really bad in here, like I said, London must have been super stinky because they're like, because it would have smelled like bodies, right? Like, let's be clear. It would have, that's a very horrible, very specific smell. But they were just like, smells a bad smell in here. And I'm like, I don't know what London smelled like at this time, but the fact that they're not even like, they're not gagging as they walk into this room, it tells me that it was a level of stinky that I don't even understand.
What I love the most about this film, I have to say, well, love is a strong word. What I'm interested most about this film, and this kind of comes from comparing it to another Richard Fleischer movie, The Boston Strangler, which has a very weird ending where the last third of the film is basically, you know, a killer given a chance to go into full exposition mode, to just like, it's just a psychoanalytic scene of the killer. And here we dispense with all of that. There's absolutely no interest in Christie and what his motivations are, what his childhood was, what the explanation for his methods or his madness was. None at all. Everything is so centered on this one murder in particular and the toll that it took on other people, as opposed to anything that motivates Christie to commit the crimes that he did. That when we see what happens to him after he moves out, the bodies are discovered, he's living in a flop house. He gets approached by a police officer on the middle of the street and kind of, in a half-hearted attempt, kind of tries to lie about his identity, but people know who he is already. And we end there. We end at him being apprehended. We know that he was also hanged. I love that as a filmmaker, it's so uninterested in the killer. It's just interested in the circumstances that would allow for him to be so cavalier about his murders and so in your face that nobody really notices until bodies literally fall out of the walls.
Right. Because you think, like, like, nowadays you think, well, surely you'll get caught after you murder your upstairs neighbor and your wife, right? Yeah. Surely that's the point where you're like, okay, well, that's a little close to home. That's how you get caught. And it isn't. And it's just the idea, again, like, how we view these figures in society usually is that they're like these masterminds, whatever. And I was like, he had nothing. He's living in, like you said, a flop house. And he's literally like, it's like, you got away with murder and you don't even it's not even like a gift to you. It's not even like, and now I get to like live this life because I've gotten away with all the evil. It's like, no, you're just hanging around London with nothing.
Just still on your bullshit.
In the way that like, in America, when there are serial killers at a certain point in time, when they were traveling between state lines, we understand why it was difficult to catch them, right? Because police weren't sharing information across state lines. There wasn't a quick way to do that. There wasn't the internet. There wasn't like all this stuff. In London, we know it's a big city, but it's still small enough that it's like, this would have been such a huge story. This would have been all anyone was talking about for weeks, right? And because he was a key witness, his picture would have been in the paper, which he enjoyed, obviously. But like, it's like, yeah, you're like the equivalent of viral at that point. And the fact that you're still in London trying to like say you're someone different is just, there's something again like so pathetic about like his ending, about how he even got caught. Like literally, as the police officer being like, "Who are you?" and then being like, "No, you're this person." And here, off we go. Like that's it. Like after all of that, that's it. That's what you did. It took him a while to even admit to every killing, right? Like they kept finding bodies, and then he was like, "Oh, okay, I also killed that person." And then he never admitted to killing Geraldine, the baby. He wouldn't admit to being a baby killer. It was obviously him at this point, right? He admits to killing Beryl, but will never admit to killing. Even he knows that that's like worse. That's so bad. That's not even part of what he likes doing, right? That was a necessity thing. That was housekeeping. And even the pictures of him, the real John Christie being arrested, like he's just covering his face.
It's embarrassment.
Yeah.
It's in the way that, I feel like this film really is a truly British horror film, is that the worst possible thing that can happen to Christie is public embarrassment.
Yeah.
It's not murder, it's not jail, it's not execution. It's embarrassment.
Yeah. If you think about shows like Mindhunter, where there's like idea of like this resource of understanding why he did it, they are not interested. They're like, "No, you're evil. We're gonna get rid of you immediately. You have to die immediately." And that's like how the British system, they were just like, "Oh, we don't know like anything about you. We just want you to be gone." And I think that's also so fascinating that there's like no curiosity. They're just like, he's depraved. He did these terrible things. He needs to go. And that's the extent of it. As far as I know, he didn't murder anyone else, right? After he left Rillington Place, as far as I know, he didn't kill anybody else. And I wonder, it's fascinating because it's like, obviously with serial killers, usually there's escalation, right? They can't stop, which is usually how they get caught. Rather than it being like, so it's like, it was so specific to his like circumstance, to having a place, to having that cover, to having somewhere, I guess, like kind of put the bodies and whatever. How was his mind that he couldn't do it anymore? Like, because it was obviously a compulsion. Like there's so many questions that are unanswered.
Before I move on to The Vanishing, I just want to ask, did you ever see the miniseries adaptation, Rillington Place?
I did.
What did you make of it by comparison? Because I've only seen a few moments of it. I wanted to kind of get a little bit of the vibe of it, especially Tim Roth's performance as Christie.
I did like the mini. I think it's like 3 episodes, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
But like, I still think it's true enough to the thing that it still feels like the true story. It is slightly more like polished in the sense of like everyone's a bit cleaner. Like even Tim's character and stuff, I don't know, there's something a bit more like wholesome. And it's like, I like that the 97-1 film doesn't need to make those characters wholesome to make it still terrible what happened to them. It's like, yes, they're in this difficult marriage. Yes, he was violent. Yes, all this stuff. But this should never have happened still. And I think they made John Christie kind of a more intimidating figure. Like his wife is played by Samantha Morton. And there's a kind of a sense of feeling that she maybe knows a bit earlier on that he's doing stuff. And also that she's scared of him in a way that we don't see in a 97-1 film, right? There's kind of like a more controlling more intimidating feeling about John Christie.
Mm-hmm.
And I do like the miniseries, and I do like Tim Roth's performance, but I feel like Attenborough's choice of playing him the way he does is more interesting than what Tim Roth does with him.
And again, this is a very superficial take because I haven't seen a full series yet, but just knowing Tim Roth as an actor, he's always had a little bit of a menace and an edge to him in all of his performances. Right. You know, and he kind of dials that up or down depending on what the role is. He's never kind of been a wholesome kind of presence on screen. And while that works on paper, I think kind of one of the reasons why Attenborough's performance sticks out so much, it is because it goes so against our perception of him and our memory of him. You know, if you're coming at this like I did with, Jurassic Park Attenborough, kind of old, kindly grandfather figure Attenborough, I'm like, this is, it's disturbing to see it in that way. And I think that with Tim Roth, he's always had that little bit of a fuck around and find out energy about him. Yeah. That I don't think that's what makes a figure like Christie in this story menacing. Exactly. I think the idea that you would, for all intents and purposes, think he's kind of like a regular nice man who's maybe a bit too nosy, or maybe nothing like that. And I think with Tim Roth's performance of it, there's a hint of anger when he's doing the killings, and I like that in the Attenborough version. There's none of that. It's like desire almost. It's like depraved desire rather than, there's no anger at all behind it. The underlying thing is that he hates these women, like, you know, that's, and also I think it's played more calculatedly. It feels like he's caught out because a couple of things have gone wrong, rather than that he just wasn't thinking about the after effects, and actually he wasn't like some genius. He was very much living in the moment. It's more traditional in that sense, but it is good. It's a really good cast. Jodie Comer plays Beryl. So we've talked enough about Christie, but let's move on to The Vanishing, or Spoorloos, which, you know, is The Vanishing got remade twice by the same director. We might talk a little bit about the 90s American remake at the end, but the original 1988 Dutch film, most of it in French though, which ironically was the reason why it was disqualified for the Academy Awards in 1988, is one of those. They wouldn't consider it. It wasn't eligible to be, Denmark's film that they offered to the Academy Awards to represent them, because it was mostly in French. Most of the dialogue is in French. So they disqualified it, and Denmark went, well, okay, well then fuck you then. We're not going to present a film this year, and they didn't. Oh. Yeah. The Academy asked it again, the Academy. Yeah. So this is one of those films that I knew of, similarly to 10 Rillington Place, and I had not yet seen. But again, its reputation preceded it. How did you first come to this film, and what was your experience of watching it? So I saw it, I think, in my 20s at some point at a screening that someone was just putting on. So this is when I worked at Picture House, Hackney Picture House, and everyone I knew who worked there worked in films. So I was at a lot of screenings. Basically, if there was a film event in London that was like a weird screening of a film that isn't in cinemas anymore, I was probably there during this period of time. So I'm not even sure where I saw it, but I was just seeing everything all the time. But I remember I had no like pre-knowledge of anything about it. So it was bizarre because I didn't even know it was about a girl that gets kidnapped, really. Like I literally had nothing, no information. And so when you start the film, like you start in a very different place, right? I'm like, okay, couple on a road trip, very nice. And then you're just like, wait a minute. Oh no, wait a minute. Oh no, wait a minute. And I was surprised every instant. I was like, oh no. Like I never knew what was going to happen next. And it was fascinating. It was a fascinating way to watch it, because you're literally just like,
I don't even know what film this is, because you think it's one film and it's a different film and it's a different film again, and you're just like, oh my god. And then by the end you're just like, well, those are things I just saw. Like, I really didn't, which is fascinating because I haven't seen it. So I watched it whenever I did in my 20s, and I watched it again for this episode, and it's the first time I've seen it since then. And it was interesting watching it, knowing where it's going.
How did that change? So let's first of all kind of I'll do a spoiler warning in the introduction, but maybe because I think this film is one of those, it's on the Criterion Collection, so it's kind of been sanctified already, but perhaps this is one that is less accessible to people, so maybe let's sort of sell people on it at first before we go fully into all the details at the end.
Right, so we start in a car with Rex and Saskia, who are a couple. It's very much like they're young, they're, it's the very, like, summer in Europe vibes, right? Like, she's got her perfect summer in Europe, like her little white jeans, little yellow vest, her sandals. They've got the car packed up, they've got the bikes on top of the car. They're
beautiful, they're young, they're in love, they're Danish.
They're sun-kissed, yeah. It's all just like it paints a very specific picture. And then what I will say is that there are omens, right? There are things that were being told. So Saskia tells Rex about a dream she has where she's floating through space in an egg, and then she collides with another egg, and, like, it means, like, something important or big or bad is going to happen. And then that's the first omen. The second omen is they run out of gas in the middle of a dark tunnel, which is terrifying, right? Which is already, like, a scary, regular thing that you'd be like, this is, at any point if this happened to you, you'd be like, this is very scary, because obviously, like, you're hoping that everything coming through the tunnel sees you, and, like, in time. And also, this is, like, I don't know exactly, they're in France, I'm guessing, at this point as well, and it's like European roads where probably people are barreling down the road. Like, so and he leaves her to get gas, right? Which is, again, our second omen. She's begging him not to leave her. She's looking for the torch. He doesn't want to wait. And she's, like, screaming at him, and she's crying, and she's like, please don't leave me here. And he does. He goes, and there's kind of a look on his face, this smug kind of, that'll teach her look, when he leaves, right? Goes to get gas, comes back. She's not in the car when she comes back. Third omen. Not in the car when he comes back. So he fills up the car, drives out, and then she's waiting with her torch outside the thing. And it sets up a tense kind of atmosphere. But then they make up. It's all good, right? But those were your signs that something terrible is going to happen. Like, you think the ordeal, like, for them, as a couple on the trip, you probably think this is the worst thing that's going to happen on this trip. No, they're wrong. And I can't even explain.
So Saskia disappears within
at a service station.
Saskia disappears within the first, like, 10-15 minutes of the movie starting. And that's when we get the first shift.
Yeah.
And
because she disappears in a way that's, like, so horrific, because she just popped to the shop, which a million of us would have done a million times, and then she just doesn't come back, and there's a million people, but no one sees anything.
And then she's gone, and Rex, her boyfriend, is just left trying to do whatever he can to raise the alarms, wait for her around. He waits till nightfall, he goes to the police, and then there's another shift. And this really is a movie that lives and dies by its structure and its editing. And, I think that's what makes it so radically different of a viewing experience from any other average abduction, murder type thriller or horror film. Because we're fully into Saskia's disappearance and Rex's grief and obsession, but then we shift to the point of view of the guy who abducted her. So what did you make, especially on your second viewing, knowing what happens, what did you make of the way that this film plays around with perspectives?
It's really clever. Like, even the abduction bit is so, I started noticing these details. Like, so Saskia has the car keys because she's going to drive the last leg, right? And so even stuff like he can't drive around, he can't go look for her in a specific way. There's all these people, which somehow makes it harder because no one's really paying attention to anyone because there's too many people to pay attention to, right? You don't notice anything in that situation. The frustration of like, yeah, what do you tell the police? I was at a service station. My wife went to get like drinks, and now she's gone. Is such a weird story, and his perspective of like, yes, we did have a fight. Yes, I did leave her in a car in a tunnel for a little bit. Like, there's all these things that like it's so stacked against him, right? So I was like, this makes it so like it's so fascinating because he is between like a rock and a hard place. It's such a difficult thing to explain, to understand. It's so confusing from his point of view. Then the shift to the murderer is just like,
it's not introduced by anything, so it makes it very like all of a sudden it's like watching this other dude just go about his day, be with his family, and rehearse an abduction.
And you know there's something off. It's one of those people where you were like, when you're watching him as we're watching him, right, as an observer, and we're watching voice practice, you're like, yes, there's something off, but not enough that you'd really, when you see him with his family and stuff, when they're doing this screaming thing, which it's, he basically gets his daughter, he had put spiders in the drawer.
Yes.
So that his daughter will scream, and then he gets his other daughter to scream to compare, and then he gets his wife to scream, and he screams, then asks the owner of, or the person who lives like closest by, could you hear them scream? And he's like, no, I didn't hear anything. And that's him testing if you could hear anything.
Yes.
That was his little plan to test if you could hear anything nearby. And it's just like, it's so unsettling because it's the nightmare version of this situation, right? Where it is this incredibly smart, well thought out, practice makes perfect. He's literally practicing how he approaches women, how the abduction actually happens, like how he talks to, like, he's rehearsing all these little things to get it just right. And it's like, that's the worst case scenario.
He is, and it's interesting watching these films together because he is like a more considerate version of Christie. He's very unassuming, very polite, very mild-mannered, like near beloved. You know, he's a middle school teacher. He's got a wife and kids. His wife is, you know, into him. She's concerned that he might be having an affair because he's driving around so much. But really, and he is almost gooberish in his approach to murder because he rehearses it down to how much his heart rate gets elevated when he tries to kidnap women. He goes to different places. He makes mistakes, like he accidentally inhales the chloroform that was meant for his would-be victim. You know, he is constantly, you know, rehearsing how he would incapacitate a woman in his car, how he would open a door, the things that he would say to them. Like, there's so much minutia and detail in his going about it that, similarly to 10 Rillington Place, it makes murder uncinematic almost. This is not interesting to watch. And the filmmaker kind of completely disposes with any serial killer movie conventions in the sense that he doesn't use, you know, creepy music. He films it in broad daylight. He films these characters head on in the most kind of unsexy, grand situations, particularly Raymond, the abductor, because he films him head on being an absolute twat.
Oh, yeah, it's like a comedy of errors.
Yeah.
Like, all the little things he gets wrong, it's like, lol. Like, oh, you can see him being like, can you believe? Like, I tried to abduct a woman, I did this thing wrong. Like, how dumb of me. And you're just like, what? Who are you? Like, where did you come from?
Yeah.
And it's like almost filmed like, there's like this like genuinely like a comedy of errors. Like you said, he sneezes, he gets one in his car, but then he sneezes into the chloroform hanky by accident, and he has to like excuse himself because he's accidentally chloroformed himself. When he asks someone to help him with his trailer, and the trailer's too light that it doesn't make sense he'd ask for help, especially a woman.
He gets slapped by the woman's boyfriend or husband.
Yeah. And it's just like all these things, or like him being like him underestimating that it's weird that he'd even offer, like women are just like, no, I don't want to get in your car. Thanks, I'll walk over there. Like underestimating the wariness women have around a man on his own asking you to get into his car, right? And the fact that the abduction of Saskia even kind of happens by accident. She
goes to him.
Comes to him. Yeah. And all these little planning, all these little like situations he imagines and stuff don't even matter, because it actually just works out that she comes to him, because even though he's planned so meticulously, he actually can't get a woman in his car and like not paying attention enough, like when he's planning it, when he's trying. He almost wants it too bad. He's trying too hard. When he tries to pick up a hitchhiker and her friend jumps out, and it's like, yeah. And it's interesting because the reason that she's hidden her friend, who's a boy, right, from when she's hitchhiking, is because she knows already that a man's more likely to pick up if he just sees her. And then she's hoping that they'll be too embarrassed to say, I just want to pick you up on your own, right? It's like, so there's all these things already that make it difficult for him, right? There's all these awarenesses around that make it difficult, because women are like already aware that it's like, yeah, you're fucking, it's weird. Why couldn't you want me to get in your car?
We'll talk about the actual kidnapping, which really comes at the very end of the film.
Yeah.
And like, I think the thing that kept me absolutely glued to it was the structure that I mentioned before, because it jumps backwards and forwards in time, jumps backwards and forwards with perspective between Rex, the boyfriend of Saskia, and Raymond, her kidnapper. We're constantly seeing the same situation from their two very different perspectives and what leads up to that situation. And kind of we're moving forward 3 years with Rex still very much obsessed with Saskia's disappearance, still painstakingly gluing disappearance notices to telephone poles and on streets all around it, going to TV, talking about this case, still holding out hope, maybe not for her survival, but that he might be able to get an answer. And simultaneously, we're seeing all of this prep for this kidnapping. And all of this, and this is the thing that really struck me about halfway through, it's all broad daylight. This is all very, very, very polite, very straight-laced filmmaking, very straight-laced characters. You know, Rex is unfolding and really kind of breaking down in several occasions, but a lot of the other times he's got this like dogged obsession that's guiding him to find an answer, to find closure, to find out what happened to her. There's no mysticism, there's no actual like darkness that is being portrayed. It really is going into the same well of evil in plain sight in a way, and also this idea that sometimes it is just random and there is no great terrible meaning or intention behind it, and it is just someone that crossed paths with someone they shouldn't have at the exact right time, and conditions were met to allow for this terrible thing to happen. And it goes no deeper than that. There is no profound reason why Saskia was targeted. There is no specific intention that Raymond had. In fact, the fact that he doesn't see, his only intention is to prove to himself that he can do it, that he can get away with this terrible thing, the most terrible thing that he could imagine in a particular moment. And everything else is just random.
Yeah. But it's fascinating because that's how he presents it, right? I just want to do this terrible thing. He says because, you know, he rescued a kid from drowning and his daughter thinks he's the best person ever. And he's like, I want to see if I can do the worst thing. Because that would actually prove, like, I don't know, he just wants to prove something to himself. But the fact that he can't let it go, the fact that he's sending Rex postcards after the fact, says something else about him. He still needs it to be known. It's not enough that he did it and he got away with it. He needs to be known in a certain way, which is, I think, the connecting trait through serial killers in general. There seems to always be this desire to be known, right? And the same with John Christie. Even the fact that he presents Beryl's body on the bed, like to thing, and when he talks to police, he's like, I was in papers. There's something about being visible, in some way that seems to connect, like this kind of like specific kind of like sociopathy. And it's like interesting because like he could have just lived his life, he got away with it, right? Nothing
Yeah.
to connect him. No one even, there's nothing. He literally could have just, like, if the whole reason was why he said he just wanted to see if he could do it. He did it. Okay, you know now. But it's not enough. Not enough. He has to be known. And that there's a shot. So when the first time when we first flash forward and Rex is in a cafe, he's been sent this postcard saying to come to this cafe, like, and it's like 3 years later, and he's with his new girlfriend, his poor, long-suffering new girlfriend, who has to deal with his obsession with Saskia. And there's this amazing shot where it pans from looking at him and his girlfriend at the table, and it pans round to behind them, and we see Raymond on the balcony opposite.
Mm-hmm.
It specifically is like, and here's a perspective change, and it's amazing.
Because in this scene, it's Raymond watching Rex wait for him for hours and hours until he loses it in public and kind of starts screaming at the air.
Well, yeah, when he comes back eventually, yeah. And it's just amazing to see, like, him watch it, and it's because we know who this is. It seems so obvious to us, like, just look up, Rex, look up. Rex is waiting there for hours, then Raymond eventually comes to the cafe and sits like a couple of tables over, and it's, again, there's this need he has for some reason to be close, or to like be near this person that he did this thing to, he knows is still hurting and still obsessed about it. He can't help himself, and it's so interesting. With everything he does, he's closer to being caught. He's closer to something bad happening to him, and he can't stop himself. And I find that, like, so fascinating. Raymond is such a fascinating character.
Well, I find Rex also really interesting, particularly the way that the film shows his obsession, years after Saskia's disappearance. He's in a whole other relationship, and he still fully cannot let go. He's still trying so hard. And there is, even after the meeting with Raymond, even after Raymond comes to him and, jiggles Saskia's car keys in front of him to demonstrate that he is the man that he's been looking for. There's something to his obsession that is really completely selfish.
Yeah.
But in a very understandable way. It's what they call ambiguous loss, right? This idea that it's incredibly difficult and traumatizing to not know what happened to a loved one that suddenly just disappears. You don't know whether they're dead or alive, or how, or what happened to them, whether they suffered, where are they now? That kind of inability to let go of the idea of closure is his downfall in the end. But I wonder what you think of his performance, because throughout the film, he's the character that probably goes through the most. Raymond is relatively unmoving, unshaken. Kind of, even when he's toying around with Rex, he's still very, very calm, very bland almost. But Rex really goes from, being this fool in love to being this desperate man to kind of having the most sensible, understanding breakup on screen, to fully indulging in his obsession with finding this man, like, very publicly so. And there's something so uneasy about seeing a man lose it so consistently, so diligently, and so in public.
Yeah, he keeps going on TV to talk about he just wants to know what happened to her. He just needs to know what happened to her. So it's like, so for me, watching it, I was like, so he needs to know for him, right, for his own peace of mind. And it gets to the point where he desperately so needs to know that he can't get over this, to the point where he's willing to put himself in danger to know what happened, to know the details of what happened to her. It's like you said, the selfish thing, because it is that thing of, like, it feels more tied into the fact that he feels guilty, right? They had that argument. He left her, he let her go somewhere by herself. Like, there's all these things you do to yourself after that, right? Why didn't I go to the shop? Why didn't I go with her? why did we have that argument beforehand? Why did all these little things you'd be playing over in your head, right? And I feel like there's definitely the feeling of Rex as protector of like, I feel I need to know about this because I need to know almost that there was nothing I could have done, and I need to know like how I failed exactly as this person who's meant to do this. Because the whole time he's getting postcards, right, from this person who kidnapped I think she's his wife, right? He's getting postcards, and I'm like, Rex, get a weapon. This person clearly, I would be so prepared. I'd be like, if I ever find them, I'm not going to ask any questions. It's going to be immediate. We'll figure it out later. Immediate like harm or injury to this person. Even when he's with Raymond, like after he's in the car, I'm like, Rex, find a rock, find a big rock, do something. Like, that's how you want a Saskia. When they stop at like a park to stretch their legs, I'm literally like willing him to I'm like, go pick up a big rock, Raymond. Rex, this is your time. This is your time. This is when you do this. Even when he first starts hitting, Raymond first reveals himself to him and he like hits him, the punches are so weak. I'm like, you gotta put more in this. You got to get at least one face.
But I
love
that. I think that's one of my one of the most unexpected things about this film, right? Is because we have seen revenge narratives play out in so many different ways, and they're usually like very violent, when it's sort of a cathartic kind of violence. But here he's so weakened. He is a shell of a man, like down to the way that the actor is kind of made up. He looks gaunt. His hair is greasy. Like, he used to have this like very beautiful floppy dark hair, and then it's sort of like greasy, he's falling down his face. He's got this like very vacant, intense expression in his eyes where like he just needs to know no matter what. And then even when after he is confronted by Raymond and Raymond offers him a cup of spiked coffee. Yes. He throws it in his face, but then he considers it and he takes it because the need to know is so intense and it is so crippling. I think if he was filmed throwing a good punch at Raymond, that would have taken me out of the movie. It is so committed to this character who is haunted by an act of violence that happened close to him that he didn't see. That he not only that he couldn't stop, but he doesn't know what it is. So he's just like, you can just imagine him for 3 years going over and over and over. What could have possibly happened? Was she taken? Was she just killed? Was she robbed? Was she raped? Did she run away? Was she there to meet someone else? What the fuck happened? And these omens that you were describing earlier as well, kind of weighing so heavily, the story about the golden egg, about the colliding of the two eggs, the Polaroid that he takes of her. He's watching her. He's taking a picture of her in the very moment where she gets abducted and he doesn't see. The way, going back to the structure and the editing of the film, but similarly to, it really made me think of Don't Look Now, in the way that it plays around with perspective, memory, the things that we remember seeing, the physical documentation or archives of the thing that we remember seeing, and how it's not enough. It does not hold the answer. So when he is confronted by Raymond, I get it. Like, why would he hurt this person, disgusting and despicable as he is? Because he's the only one who has the answer. And that is what Raymond toys with him with for the entire film, and especially for the last third when they're interacting together after they meet. And he basically tells him, I'll take you, I'll tell you what happened, but you have to do whatever I tell you to do. Yeah.
He's basically like, you have to experience, it's the only way to understand it. And I think Rex must know that must mean his like demise, right? But he does it anyway because, like you said, his desire to know. I knew Rex wasn't going to win. Like, that's not. But I just wanted Raymond's jaw to get rocked like one good time. Like, I was like, land one punch, do something once that surprises him, that makes him maybe think he's not in control. Just one time. You're definitely never going to give in. But I was like, Raymond needs one good chop in the jaw, like at least once. Because he's too confident. It annoyed me. Like, he's too calm, too confident. And it's like very Ted Bundy coded, right? Like, you know, he has the fake cast at one point. That's how because he realizes, oh, I need to be weaker. It's not like I need like more help. The task doesn't need to be more difficult. I need to be weaker. And he saves a kid from drowning, which Ted Bundy does at one point, right? Like there's these little things which like play with the idea of what is a good person actually.
It's also a real when he realizes, oh, I need to be weaker instead of the card or the situation being stronger. It's this real moment where like he realizes for the first time how other people see him. It's kind of like really pathetically sweet in the sense that he's like, oh, I guess some people, namely women, do see me as a threat because I'm this like big man that might physically hurt them. Oh, I never thought about that.
Never crossed my mind. And it's that interesting thing, right, of like the way men don't in general tend not to think about that, how women, because they go, I know I'm not good. It's like, well no, that we don't know, so we're always a bit wary. And like the first time they genuinely experience it, they're like, oh yeah, I guess if I wanted to, I could hurt. It's like, yeah, that's what we're always thinking. And he's like, yeah, surprised that women just aren't like leaping into his car. It's like, yeah, dude, like you're a strange man.
With a terrible goatee.
With just the most suspicious goatee of all time.
Literally. Like, not even the devil has a more suspicious goatee than Raymond does in this movie. No.
And it is just like, it's fascinating because they also have like, there's a line that Saskia says at the beginning. She's like, let's go off the road, like off the motorway and see some local colour. I was like, well.
You've seen it now.
Never. You're on a road. Don't go see the local colour. What are you doing, Saskia? Like, I was like, well, there's a first mistake. Like,
don't want to see any local colour.
Through the countryside of a place I don't know that well, or I don't speak the language that well. No, let's not go see local colour. Let's not do that.
Let's talk a little bit about Saskia, because she's the character we see the least of, but she's obviously, her disappearance is the most consequential thing that happens in the film. And what do you make of her and that performance?
She is just this incredibly, she's like ultimate girlfriend, right? She's like whimsical. She buys a frisbee to play with because like it's fun to stretch our legs, and she jokes about driving, and she's excited about that, and she makes fun of his like key ring, and she's just like, she's like picture perfect girlfriend, right? She's the girl you want to spend the summer with. Very bright, very open, very happy in general, quick to forgive. And
she's a summer girl.
She's a summer girl, and that's ultimately her downfall, because when she's talking to him in the, like, he's essentially thinks he's already failed, right? He's like, fuck, I fucked this up. This is just after he's chloroformed himself. He's taken off the fake cast. He's just like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just fucking this up. And then Saskia will not stop talking to him. And I'm just like watching it a second time, you're like, Saskia, shut up. Step away from the man, from the weird goateed man.
But this is the brilliance of the film, right? Like, this point, and this is very much towards the end. This is after Raymond has had he's accidentally chloroformed himself, and he's like, okay, Goober, I'm gonna let this go. I'm gonna take off my cast. I'm gonna have a coffee, go back home, because I can't do this. Yes, I can't do this. This is not working out. All my preparation has been for naught. And Saskia approaches him, and she chats to him, and she keeps chatting to him. And at this point, we know that she's gone. We know the devastation this causes. We know he's done it. We know he's been preparing. We as the audience have all of this information. And she is so open-hearted and open-minded, and kind of has this lightness about her in her eyes that was devastating. I'm like, please be more suspicious.
Like,
like, don't fucking trust anyone, let alone a random man who invites you.
What are you doing? Why, when he says get in the car, it's like, Saskia, think for a second. Why would you need to get in the car? Why would you need to get in the car, my love?
Well, she sees a picture of him and his family, and she does this little smile, gets in the car, and immediately he's choking her with a napkin full of chloroform. And the camera stays on her eyes for like maybe, I don't know, it felt like 5 minutes. It definitely wasn't that long. It was maybe 30 seconds, but it stays on her eyes as this kind of incredulity passes through them because she cannot understand how this very nice man who has a family is doing that to her right now. Broad daylight, surrounded by people.
Yeah. And it's just that thing of like, yeah, like definitely the moral is like, well, don't trust men in general. Why does he want you to get in the car? Always be suspicious of that. Like, he's getting you a key and he's selling you. He can get it and get out. He can literally hand it to you through the open door. You do not need to get in there. And it's just the fact she's always, not to victim blame, like I feel for Saskia, but she's almost begging. She's literally just like, hello, I'm incredibly kidnappable. Like that is her approach to Raymond in the coffee place. He is like at this point given up. Even when she starts talking to him, he's not even immediately like, oh, a new opportunity. He's just like, okay, yeah, cool. And then he like slowly is like, oh, okay. Like, honestly, it's frustrating to watch the second time. You're just like, Saskia, please just take your drinks back to the car. Just stop talking to this man. Please, the love of God.
It made me deeply sad in a way because like obviously this is a Danish production, so in a way like it makes a bit more sense because you would almost think, well, you know, somewhere like America where they have a big culture of serial killers and of serial killer media, no one in their right mind would do that. They'd be like, no, I've seen enough crime documentaries. But also notably it did, media and coverage of real life murderers had a huge effect on things like hitchhiking. Like people stopped doing that because of the amount of killings that were the amount of people that were murdered because they were picked up by random serial killers picking up victims on the highways. Like that is a notable thing, that kind of a cultural thing of America that no longer exists directly because of the media impact of serial killer coverage. So like you almost understand why in different countries around the world you just wouldn't expect that, you know, you just think, oh, that's something that doesn't happen here. It just doesn't exist here.
Well, it's very European, right? Like it's very much like this, oh, everything's just, because it's more tantamount to what, like, in America, before they realized that children got kidnapped for like terrible reasons, right? Before they did, when they finally realized that children weren't just like running away, it's like, oh no, sometimes people do bad things to them, like, which is like around the 80s when they were a bit like, oh wait, it's like tantamount to that, where kids would have no reason not to trust adults, like in a way that they were just like, oh yeah, well, it's an adult telling me to do a thing, so I guess it's probably fine because no one's warned me yet about strangers in the way that we do now. And like how parents used to be like, come home when the street lights come on, the door will just be unlocked, like that kind of thing. It feels like that kind of era of innocence where like you're hitchhiking in Europe, of course it's fine. And there is a sense of like, you know, like I said, the female hitchhiker is like hides her male friend before, like, so because she knows she's more likely to get picked up on her own. And there's a kind of a sense of it, but not enough of a worry about it that you're going to be. And I remember when I was in France as a teenager, we used to hitchhike. And which, like, why? Like, literally, like, when I was like 15, we go so we go camping with my family every year in this one place in France, which is really the countryside. There's nothing, no internet, no nothing like that. Our parents wouldn't know where we were. We'd just be like, we're going to walk to the town today, the next town, and it'd be like maybe 3 or 4 of us, and we'd hitchhike. Like, I didn't speak French, not a lick of French. And didn't think anything of it because you're just in this quaint French town. Who would murder me here?
Raymond would.
Raymond would. But like, to be fair to me, I was like 15 years old. But Saskia, it is just frustrating watching her continue this conversation, and because she's trying to buy a new keyring for Rex. So it's all in the service of doing this cute little thing to get him a cute little gift, and which makes it all the more horrible.
Moral of the story is, don't be cute.
Don't be cute. Don't do a cute thing for a guy. Don't do that. Don't talk to random man. Be suspicious of all of them.
Be suspicious at all times.
at all times, especially in a service station. Like they're just like, I don't know.
I have this
like,
thing sometimes with my boyfriend where random people on the street, or kind of, you know, at any given point, it doesn't even matter kind of the scenario, where would just like approach you with a suspicious question or something. I'm like, it's not a real thing. Let's move on. And he'll just stop and try to answer them. I'm like, no, let's move on. What? This is not a real concern or a real question, and this is clearly a setup for something else. I'm moving on swiftly.
I've had that before. I've been seeing someone, and like I've responded to a guy approaching me like out of the blue with a weird question, so hostile, and they've been like, "Why are you so rude?" I'm like, "I don't want to get murdered today." Like, no, especially now in the age of internet. I'm like, I can see his phone in his hand. Look it up. Why are you asking me? Why have you approached me specifically? I'm 5'2". Like, I don't know. I weigh as much as like a bag of potatoes. Like, I'm a carrier-weighable. Not today. It's like, I would rather be hostile and that person go away being like, she was rude, and then being completely innocent, than the other thing.
I'd rather be rude but alive.
Yeah. The other thing's worse. I don't care if he thinks I'm a bitch, that's fine. But like absolutely not today. And I was like, I completely get it. Like, and she just doesn't, bless her heart, she does not have it. She is just like, oh, great, I'm going to get a key ring for 30. And she's like, same price as a Frisbee. Like, she's so innocent. She's so sweet. And it also feeds into the narrative, like, for the story, right? Which is, this is why Rex is so, I don't think it's an accident that his next girlfriend, we see him as a dark-haired, chain-smoking, like, much moodier vibe of a girlfriend, right? It's like Saskia was the sunshine, right? He's fixated on her because she literally fit the role of this perfect summer child that he was, like, in love with and whatever, and they're about to be on this perfect trip. And it's encapsulated in this like sepia toned memory, like leading up to that, right? And I don't think it's an accident that his girlfriend after that is like much moodier, much like, it's a much darker energy. And that's why he's fixated on Saskia. She represented not just who she actually was, she represented how his life was before that. Like, there's a conversation he has with his girlfriend where he's like, no, if she was alive now, like, I wouldn't be necessarily go back with her. But he's like, if I could go back in time to that service station and not stop that from happening, he would. He would go back to his life before, right? If he had gone through all of this and he was with this girl now and Saskia turned up, he wouldn't necessarily get back with Saskia. But if he could go back in time, he would. And because it represents him as a person was different too. Much more hopeful, much more trusting and innocent, like all these things that were taken away from him, right? And I think that's such an interesting way to phrase it. Like, yeah, I would like to go back to who I was then, to that time, to what I was doing, to that holiday, and I'd like to see that through. Yeah.
And what do you make of, you know, we've spoken about the way it unfolds, but what do you make of the actual interactions between Raymond and Rex after they finally meet and Rex goes in with him in the car? There is so much fucking conversation between them.
I know. And the most fascinating bit is where Rex mutters under his breath, arsehole, and Raymond's like, what was that? And he's like, nothing. And I'm like, what is this dynamic? Who are you people? Like, he's just in his car next to this person he knows, kidnapped, and he keeps asking if she's alive and stuff like that, where you're just like, you know she isn't. I don't think he's even nervous about Raymond killing him. He's nervous about Raymond changing his mind, almost. He's nervous that Raymond's going to be like, you know what, enough of you. Get out of my car. I'm never going to tell you. He's scared of that, which is why he's so well behaved. The whole time I'm watching it, I'm like, kill him with a hammer. Rex, find something. And it's the same thing, similar to John Christie, where he convinced him, like, you could tell the police, and then what? There's no evidence. There's nothing that ties me. Which, again, is based solely on Raymond's confidence, right? Because we've seen a million times where there's something they've forgotten, right? Something they've missed, something they've not realised. But he's so sure of himself. He's like, there's no connection to me.
The thing that really kind of disgusted me about this film is Raymond's self-confidence.
Yeah.
Because, yes, his perfect kidnapping, his perfect murder turned out to be perfect. He is not caught. He's not left any clues. he's been dangling kind of, closure in front of this poor guy for years, and he couldn't find him until he revealed himself. So technically, he is in the right. So he's so fucking smug in that car, where he talks about kind of how he thinks that there's something just missing about him, how he makes these elevated choices that nobody else would make, and illustrates it by, how he was 15, he jumped off the roof because it's the thing that nobody else would do, and it's not the logical instinct, but his mind does not work in a logical thing. You know what, Raymond? I don't give a shit. You're not special. You're not interesting, and you're not special. You're just a cunt. You're just a cunt who is like fixated on proving to the entire world that you're special and unique because you can murder a woman.
And that's what's fascinating. It's fascinating to me, right? So, like, in some serial killers would taunt the police, right, who are investigating them. But he taunts Rex specifically and then convinces him, oh, what are the police going to do? And I'm like, why would you need to convince him? If anything, you're so good, tell him to go to the police. Tell him to tell them exactly who you are. Like, actually allow that to happen, because that would be really the way to prove it's a perfect murder. If Rex goes, it was this person, he has her car keys, he's been sending me postcards, he's told me it's him, and they still can't pin anything on you, that's actually how you've done it, right? That's actually proves you're smarter than everybody. But you actually don't want that. You know he's not going to do that. You don't want that, which is why you need to hold back information, which is why you need to, like, not tell him, you're not just going to tell him exactly what happened, because you're not entirely sure, or because otherwise, like, send him to police. I don't know. It's just really fascinating, because also I don't think Rex is 100% sure that guy wouldn't be caught. It's more that he is worried that he still wouldn't know what happened. Yeah, to Saskia.
It's the closure, right? The closure is the thing that is the undoing of Rex, because he knows that it's either madness or death that awaits him. Yeah, but he needs to know.
And it's like, funny what you said, like, yeah, he is just a couple. You're just like, this is what you're so elevated and you're so much smarter than everyone. You can do a perfect murder, and this is what you're doing with it. This very specific skill of yours, you're just like a regular family guy. I'm like, really? Mm-hmm. Really? That's so interesting to me, because I'm just like, why isn't your life more interesting if this is what you're capable of? Like, what are we doing with this specific set of skills? And I just have 2 kids and a wife, and I live in an apartment. I just drive around. I send, like, my fun time is me sending postcards to the devastated, partner of this person I killed.
It's the watching. He's a voyeur of suffering, really.
And it's always interesting to me when someone pitches themselves as, I'm so smart. It's like, and what are you doing with that? What are you doing with that? You're so good at things, and your life in any way doesn't, like, really reflect. That's the thing. It doesn't mean anything if no one knows.
And what do you make of the ending? And specifically, not just what happens, which is that Raymond buries Rex alive, presumably in the same way as he did to Saskia, but the way that it's filmed, which is just this little gliding shot over some grass, some green grass growing over the graves.
It's fascinating. There's a bit in the car where Rex asks him if he raped Saskia, and, like, Raymond dismisses it. Similar to Christie, he'd never do that. He's not some sort of monster, right? In the same way Christie doesn't admit to killing Geraldine, in the same way he's like, I'm not a violent man, right? In the same way he doesn't want to hurt Beryl when he kills her. Raymond is like, oh god, like, no, like, that's clear. Why would you even? Which, from the outside, right? If a woman gets kidnapped, obviously that's the first thing you think, right? That's the first thing you think is happening. But he buried her alive, which I'm sure all of us can appreciate would be one of the most terrible ways to die slowly in a coffin under the ground. And I think it's interesting, because I think what Rex probably has imagined over these years is so much more violent and so much worse than what it is. And because he wakes up in the coffin, comes to in the coffin, and he, like, starts screaming his name and laughing, right? He has a lighter that I think is the one that Saskia bought him all those years ago. And now he knows, and now what? What does he do with that?
And he's trapped with that knowledge. forever.
Yeah, and even though it is a terrible way to die, it's so not as bad probably of the things he imagined in his head that it's almost like an anticlimax. I think for him, I think it's almost like, oh my god, this is it, and this is it. This is what my whole life has been up from that point. Has been this is what I want to find, and this is it. It's not even this tortured, awful thing that I think he kind of almost wanted to know. Like it was like, you know, it was this horrible person who's going to do all these awful things to her, and I want to feel that pain too. It's almost an anticlimax because it's so simple, and so it's just this. He's not even doing anything to you. He doesn't even care enough to be hurting you in any specific way. It's just you're buried alive, and he's forgotten about you, and that's it. That's it. And it's gut wrenching. It's horrible. Like to be like, oh, and that's just what it's all led to.
That's all that's left. It's just newspaper coverage of the two of them. It really is so unbelievably bleak because unlike 10 Rillington Place, which obviously is different because it's based on a real life case, but there is closure and resolution. We know what happened. We know how it happened. We know who did it, and we know how it ends. But the resolution is so unbelievably casually bleak where it just ends. And there's nothing else.
No.
We're spared the death of Saskia. It's very much implied.
Yeah.
But Raymond is at large. He's still living his middle class life in his small town in France.
Yeah.
And the film just ends. And I wonder as well, you know, this film is kind of infamous for having fascinated Stanley Kubrick. You know, it's very often said that he thought that this was the most terrifying film he'd ever seen. Do you find Spoorloos, The Vanishing scary?
Yes, in the way that it's like there's no relief, right? So basically, usually you're waiting, even if it still ended in Rex's death, you're waiting for that bit. It's a relief for him, at least, that he found out, and that never comes, right? It's not actually a relief. It's just like this huge anticlimax. And again, it's this idea, like you said earlier, this random act, this just wrong place, wrong time situation, where it's just based on nothing. There's no reason for it, really. Just something terrible happens, and it has ripples beyond the actual event, right? Like it happens, and then 3 years later, this person still can't get over it, right? It's like I said, the worst case scenario. This person just wants to do this, has thought about it, has planned it, and is now doing it, and that's it. There's no other reason. If you dug deeper, his explanation, even though he gives one as to why he was curious, is not satisfying in any way. Even if Raymond did get arrested, that would be so unsatisfying to hear the explanation of why this happened, because I think often we're looking for a reason, right? We want to know at least you're ill, like there's something so wrong with you that this is we want to know something about your childhood. You want to know something that, you know, we want a reason. And the worst case is always when there isn't one, when it's just, oh, I wanted to see if I could and I did.
Yeah.
And I think that's so hard for us to wrap our heads around. And the fact, like you said, it's in broad daylight, the fact that this could happen in a busy place, in a place where you feel, for the most part, incredibly safe, right? What's going to happen to you here in this service station with loads of cars, loads of staff, like all this stuff? Because it wouldn't even cross your mind that something was going to happen to you here, aside from something like maybe I'll get hit by a car, maybe there'll be an accident, something like that. You never expect to be like abducted. And especially, like you said, there's no reason for you. It's not like no one's looking for a ransom. You don't have knowledge of anything that would be the reason you're being abducted. And in this case, it's not even like a sexual, like gross sexual gratification or it's just to take your life. It's just to see if they could. And I think that is genuinely terrifying.
I think you've nailed it, is that just to see if I could. Yeah. Just to see if I can. Like a little self-challenge.
I think a reason, even if it's a reason that we would never could never justify a reason that we don't fully understand, a reason still like usually makes it a little bit easier, right, to swallow. It's a little bit like, okay, so these are the events that led up to you being like this, and this is the reason you needed to do this, and that doesn't really ever come in this film in a way that's satisfying. And the idea, like in the same way in Rillington Place, like the idea of your downstairs neighbor being like your murderer, like the idea of being kidnapped in broad daylight in a busy public place.
Well, what's more haunting, I think, for me is it's not just the how banal and how uninteresting Raymond and Christie both are as people, and how deliberately uninterested the films that we've been discussing are in psychoanalyzing them, because that would be giving them too much character development, you know, like we're not here for the character development of murderers. We're here to see the circumstances and the consequences, in the case of The Vanishing, of their actions. The consequences on Rex is all we need to know to understand the murder. We don't actually need to know the details of what he did to Saskia. We just need to see the burden of that grief and how it unfolds on someone who loved her. But it's also the fact that with Raymond, he never gets caught. He never gets caught, so nobody is none the wiser. He just keeps on going, and the film ends there. There's no, oh, he got caught, or oh, he keeps on doing it. Maybe he just did these 2 murders. Maybe he would have just murdered Saskia if Rex hadn't continued to obsess over the case in the way that he did. That kind of is irrelevant. The fact is that he got away with it twice. And it just doesn't matter. And that kind of nihilistic approach to life and death in this film is horrifying. Yeah, like imagine dying because someone just wanted to prove how fucking smart they were. Like, it's just like, this is the only way? You could show it? You couldn't, there was no other way? Like, it's just so, and there's something also so revolting about the fact that Raymond needs, like, there's something so grotesque about, not only did he get away with murder, he needed someone to know, like, how smart I am. Like, that's like one of the worst points for me, is that he was like, I need you to know how, like, clever, how good I am at this. Because, like, it's that thing, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, did it even fall, right? If you did this perfect thing and no one knows, does it even matter? Does it count? Right? So I think after he does the thing with Saskia, like, almost like the finish for him is like, and then Raymond knows and they get rid of him, and I think he's like probably satisfied after that, right? Someone knew he did it, someone knew he got away with it. And I was like, that's like the worst thing. That's the worst thing that you... Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you about the American remake, which was done by the same director. And I'm always interested when that happens. So it was directed by George Sluzier and done a little bit later in 1993, starring Sandra Bullock as the Saskia character, Jeff Bridges as the Raymond character, and Kiefer Sutherland as the Rex, as the boyfriend. Did you ever watch the remake, and what did you think of it if you did? I did not, because there's something so European. I think it's so specific. And there's this thing sometimes with America, it's like, oh, it doesn't translate. It doesn't translate to the same thing when it's here. And also, there's no part of me that doesn't believe that Kiefer Sutherland would not definitely kill Jeff Bridges with a hammer. Oh my god, same. I'm like, he would murder him. Have you seen Kiefer Sutherland would I don't believe for a second this man... That man has an edge. Yeah. He's very miscast in this role. He's not pathetic. He'd be trying to kill this man. Like, no part of me would believe that he wouldn't do that. So, can I you're very spot on, because let me tell you, I had not watched the remake either, and I watched it last night directly after finishing The Vanishing, because I'm like, they're fresh in my mind. This is like that Funny Games Michael Haneke situation where the same director is remaking an already very acclaimed film. Like, let's see what happens. it's so bad. I was trying to think of like a more eloquent way of putting it. It's like, no, it's bad. It's like a guy like misunderstanding his own film, but also weirdly translating it for an American audience in the most condescending way. And can I spoil it for you?
Yeah.
And spoiler warning for a film you really should not seek out unless it's in a curiosity kind of way. He changes the ending, so the second girlfriend character in the film plays a much larger role, and Kiefer Sutherland's he's got a different name, but let's call him Kiefer's Rex. It gets a book deal to write about the disappearance of Sandra Bullock's Saskia, and he's like goes a little bit nutty in the way that writers writing a book will do. But then Jeff Bridges, who by the way is a phenomenal actor, is one of my favorite American actors, but he is basically imitating the French Raymond down to imitating that accent, that cadence of speaking. There's a couple of scenes where I'm like, oh, you're just mimicking the other guy. And I get it that if I hadn't seen them so close together, I maybe would not have noticed that, or it wouldn't have seemed as kind of similar, but it was so on the nose. And we were talking earlier about how in Dune Part 2, Austin Butler imitates perfectly the voice of Stellan Skarsgård. Well, imagine that level of mimicry.
Oh, wow.
And at the end, the girlfriend tracks down the Raymond Jeff Bridges character, figures out that he's buried Rex Keither alive, and then globbers Jeff Bridges, unearths Keith, and then Keith kills Jeff Bridges, and then they all get another book deal.
Absolutely not.
Exactly.
What the hell?
Seriously, dude, the very last scene of the movie is them being taken out for lunch by their publisher, being like, oh my god, this is going to make such a great book, blah, blah, blah. And being offered coffee by the waiter, and the both of them in unison, in a really cutesy way, be like, no, we don't drink coffee anymore.
No.
Yes.
That's sacrilegious. That is... What the fuck? Like,
exactly.
And it's because, that's the thing, it's like, the reason you can't... Some films are meant to be remade because the tone doesn't work, right? The atmosphere, the feeling, the customs, whatever, don't work in the American setting. And also, an American audience expects something. They are not great all the time, like en masse, I mean, generalizing, but like the general American public who watch films aren't great at unresolved endings, right? They're not great in the same, even in films like Pride and Prejudice, where in the American one, the 2005 one, they needed to show them kissing at the end because American audiences hated not seeing them kissing. Even though they get married, we know they're fine, they're happy, needed to see a kiss. And I'm like, that is the epitome of like what they like. It's not satisfying for them to see a film where like it just wouldn't read well. And I was like, that's just why some things, like, they're going to make another round, an American version of another round. I'm like, please don't. Again, it's so specific to being in like a European country.
But also, like, I think there's something really interesting when a director, like, for an American audience, which, you know, I read an interview with him at the time of the American movie coming out, where he's like, I think there's a really dismissive attitude towards American audiences there, which I don't think is the right mentality to go in to remaking your own film. Because there is, you know, we're talking earlier about like hitchhiking and kind of the media coverage that American serial killers have gotten even domestically, and how that impacted, you know, their own sense of themselves, their own sense of like who they can trust, and you know, the true crime media conglomerate, right? There's also this thing of like, well, how do you translate the story that is very much based on this very European politeness, this European openness to people, kind of this lack of this amount of violence. Not that Europeans have not been violent, you know, like read history. It's like blood soaked. But like, how do you translate that into a world in the 90s that is very much cognizant and mistrustful of people? Like, how do you do
Right.
it? That same Saskia scene with Sandy Bullock, and there's a part as well where she's so miscast, where she's like literally hopping and skipping at the gas station. I'm like, no. That's not who she is. That's not who she was like in the 90s when she was huge. Just like that. Also, Kiefer Sutherland, I'm sorry, I thought he was going to be the killer.
Right? Like, yeah, he seems more like a Raymond type. And it's just like, you say you could take the idea and make an American film but you have to essentially change the film. You have to really think about all those other things. You can't make the same. I feel like sometimes when it relies on the specific place, like where it's like, oh, we're here in France in this very specific time where this person wouldn't be as wary of these certain things. And it's like, that doesn't translate. I knew I wouldn't. Like, I looked at the cast and I was like, no. Sandy B? No.
Sandy
what are you
B.
doing? What are we doing?
No.
Like, she is
I can
not
believe
the
Sandy
bright-eyed-
B as Rex. I do not believe her as Saskia.
I do not believe her as Saskia. And like Kiefer Sutherland is hilarious. I'm like, that man would have killed that man with hammers. He would have. That's a different situation. That's a different film. Like Kiefer Sutherland is like pathetic, love torn. What do I do? My girlfriend's missing guy. He is. I'm going to assemble.
A task force.
Yeah, I'm going to do the worst things you've ever imagined to you when I find you.
Kiefer Sutherland,
that's who he is.
if found himself in a situation where he's being buried alive by a sociopathic goober, he would claw and punch his way, Kill Bill style, out of the coffin.
He'd kill Billy's way out of the coffin, without a doubt in my mind.
1000%.
He'd Buffy his way out of the coffin, and there's no way in that film. Like, I can't imagine Kiefer Sutherland not being like, I'm just gonna punch my way out. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Like, even like when you told me, like when you sent me the questions, like, have you seen it? I was like, I thought about watching it, and I looked at the the images, and I was like, I actually can't do it. I can't do it. I don't want to see this. I already know this is wrong.
Do you know what? I genuinely would encourage people to like watch or rewatch The Vanishing from 88 and then watch immediately after The Vanishing from 1993, because it elevates your opinion of the original so much, because it's a bad film on its own, and when you watch the source material, you're like, oh no. Oh,
like, how did we get here?
Who got paid for this? This is outrageously bad.
Like, just the casting alone, like, honestly, it's just like I said, like, the first one's so masterful. Like, that pan, I can't get over that shot in the cafe where it pans around him on the balcony. I love that shot so much, and I'm just like, this is so and like I said, the first time I watched it, when you go in blind and you're just like, oh wait, it's like several different movies, because again, you start off in one place, and even if you know something bad's going to happen, you think it's going to go down a certain way, and none of it happens the way you imagine it happening. None of it's told to you the way you'd imagine it be told to you, and it's so clever for that, and it ends, like you said, so bleak. Like, you're just like, well, that sucks. Like, that's just that's where we are. That's how it ends. And then to do I can't believe that's how the 93 one ends. That's genuinely hilarious. Genuinely hilarious.
I kind of want you to watch it now and to text me all your thoughts as you're watching it.
This is like when we watched the last episode I'd never seen of True Blood, and I was like, this is the end? Like, what do you mean this is the end? Like, I wasn't prepared. And I knew something would be off. I was like, even if this is a shot-for-shot remake, something's gonna be wrong with this. Something feels wrong about this. Everything I'm seeing feels wrong. And that's just confirmed it. That's amazing. That's amazing. I love that the coffee thing, like, no, we don't. It's like, well, everyone hasn't poisoned your coffee. It was very specifically this one man.
Yeah.
You're fine.
It's like, don't blame coffee for the decisions of Jeff Bridges.
Like, wow, amazing. Amazing.
It was an interesting exercise. Let's leave it at that. But Isaura, is there anything else about either 10 Rillington Place or The Vanishing that you wanted to bring up that we haven't covered already?
So I have a thing about, like, when we talk about horror films in general, I'm always like, I want to see the killer's little preparation. I want to see their little thoughts. And I get them in these two films. I get to see their little things. I get to see their little preparations. Because I'm like, how do you collect these things? How do you plan this thing? How do you pack your little bag? And these films, if you've ever been interested in that part of the story. These films deliver in spades that part of the story where you see the little preparations of a murderer, the little thought processes, the little whatever. And somehow that makes it all the more chilling to see how boring. Like, it's literally like, just practice makes perfect.
That's
just
the
all your little
word.
things. Yeah.
Boring.
It's like me packing up my cosmetics for like a trip. That's what it's like. That's how, as boring as you'd imagine that would be to watch me do that, that's what it's like.
Yeah.
And that's what's terrifying about it, because you're doing something enormous. You're about to do something that's going to change someone's life, end someone's life, have ripple effects for years to come, and it's boring, the lead up to it. And it reminds me of, I think it was Dennis Nielsen, who said the first time he killed someone, he expected there to be immediate sirens. He expected the world to shatter, like, immediately, right? Because you've done this massive thing and the world's told you, oh, if you kill someone, it's going to be immediately terrible. Like, they're going to get you, it's going to be... And nothing happened. There was such a big nothing that he was like, oh. Like, it was like a surprise. And it reminds me of that. Is like, it's so boring that it's almost like scarier that that's the lead up to something that's so big. That it can be so mundane. It feels like it should be bigger, and it just isn't.
I love that as a closing thought. Thank you so much for your time, your insight into these two assholes, these two boring assholes.